Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 6th of November 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you 20 minutes of gaming news and comment. Before I go on, I'd like to point out to those of you wondering why exactly I'm sounding different to usual. I am in Austin, Texas all week for the Lone Star Clash and various interesting pro-gaming activities, so I am on my mobile rig at the moment, ergo I will sound slightly different to usual. You can, however, expect regular content as always. Coming up in the show, Chris Roberts discusses the future of Star Citizen. Halo 4 is not to be released for PC anytime soon. IP failures signal horrible game sales in October. Splinter Cell Blacklist director believes that AAA games are not the future. And Remember Me's director talks about stereotypes in the industry. Chris Roberts' Star Citizen has been doing the rounds as the latest and greatest when it comes to crowd-funded upcoming titles, and he's given a fairly lengthy interview to Ars Technica on the subject of upping the ante in PC gaming, as he calls it. He talks a little bit about the amount of money that it's going to cost, which is not particularly new information, although those who do not know, the effort has so far raised over $2.6 million in pledges, and also happens to have around $10 million in promised private investment. He talked a little bit about the choice to use the CryEngine 3, saying this time around I look at it and say I could put a team together, I could build a really good engine, but that's going to take me 2 years. This is an interesting change for Chris Roberts because up to this point he has always used custom engines as opposed to an existing bespoke product. He went on to talk about the ambitious nature of Star Citizen and compared it to Freelancer, saying, think of what Freelancer had 10 years ago, it doesn't have that much less than what I'm promising right now. Rather than 100 on a server, I'm promising a meta server on top of that can bring it to millions of people. The nature of Star Citizen is certainly an interesting one, and he goes on to explain how things will actually work, claiming that the universe essentially operates like a complex matchmaking system with an awful lot of tracking going on under the hood as opposed to a traditional MMO model, which is really rather interesting indeed. Now, the red meat, for those of us who are very much PC gaming enthusiasts, he talks about the amount of power that will be required to actually create this game and why it is a PC exclusive, going on to say that this game will need 4 GB in your machine. Ars Technica seems a little confused about this because they claim that 4 GB of RAM might sound like a lot. Well, no, Ars Technica, it actually doesn't. Not in comparison to most things we're dealing with these days. Yes, most games do not take 4 GB. They don't have a footprint of 4 GB, but honestly, 4 GB of RAM for a PC gamer is actually quite low now. I think the standard is more like 8. RAM is, of course, rather cheap indeed. So honestly, I doubt that's really going to be a concern for too many PC gamers, but it does highlight interesting things like, of course, the age of console technology, the fact that there is just a lack of memory, and when it comes to big games like this that require a great deal of tracking and require a large dynamic universe, then you're just not going to be able to get that on console. There's not a huge amount of information in this article that we don't already know, but it does make for a nice read nonetheless, and those of you who happen to have any doubts about Star Citizen and its rather ambitious attempt at creating a space-based both single-player and pseudo-MMO experience, then I'd recommend heading on over to the Ars Technica article to read in full. The link is, as always, in the description below this video. Our next topic comes from the PA report on the subject of Halo 4, and this is an article by Ben Kachira, which is more of an opinion piece than anything else. It's on the subject of Halo 4 and the fact that it is not coming to PC. This article goes on to claim that it is very much a mistake, quoting a Microsoft spokesperson saying Halo 4 was designed specifically for Xbox 360, and while we're always exploring new ways to expand the franchise and share the Halo experience with as many fans as possible, we do not currently have any plans to port Halo 4 to PC. Now, I've got to say, I agree with the sentiment of the article, but it is very odd that the article doesn't actually really explain why the game should, in fact, come to PC. They go on to talk just a little bit about the subject of Windows 8 and the fact that Microsoft is attempting to push a new operating system, and indeed, Halo 4 could have actually been a selling point for that particular OS, although it's understandable why they didn't, considering that Halo 2 was supposed to be a selling point for Windows Vista. Turns out, of course, if you release a game several years too late and the technology surpasses and creates more interesting titles than what you have on offer, people don't really like to buy it. It also doesn't help that Windows Vista was actually a terrible OS, but hey, there you go. I think if you want reasoning and rationale behind this, which the article sadly does not point out, then you have to look towards the idea that games like Halo, as much as I don't really appreciate them all that much, do in fact contain FPS campaigns that are far, far closer to the original roots of first-person shooters than the current FPS that we seem to get on PC ever is. And I'm not necessarily talking about the indie FPS, I'm not talking about things like Hard Reset, I'm not talking about things like Rack, I am talking about, of course, MMS, I'm talking about Medal of Honor, Battlefield, Call of Duty when it comes to these very linear on-rail single-player campaigns. We're not talking about large, expansive levels where you do at least have somewhat of a choice as to which direction to go in. We're not talking about freeform vehicle sections. The jet section from Battlefield 3's campaign springs to mind as an example of nonsense on-rails roller coaster gameplay, and I use the term gameplay as loosely as possible here. Halo has always been about larger levels. It's always been about approaching objectives from different angles, in different ways with different weapons. It's no Deus Ex. We're not talking about that or Dishonored or anything like that, but it does at least have some freedom. It feels like the levels are designed in such a way that they're not a straight line, and that I can definitely appreciate. It's worth considering, of course, that the multiplayer is reasonable. The Forge mode isn't exactly something that I would really find all that impressive on PC, because we've had modding for many, many years, we've had level editing tools for many, many years, and while it's special on console, Forge mode is not really something new or innovative, but it would be nice to have nonetheless. It's okay to knock around in it. Who knows what could actually be created there. And it just saddens me, because honestly, I would like to play some of the Halo campaigns. I really would, but I don't want to play them with a controller. I hate FPS with a controller. It's actually a painful, annoying, fiddly experience for me. It's really irritating. It doesn't feel intuitive at all. And there you go. Well, the question is, why does Halo 4 not come to PC? I think the answer really comes down to the fact that Microsoft doesn't want to support the PC as a platform. Why? Especially considering they produce an OS, well, they're not really all that interested in gamers. They claimed that they would be putting game-specific functionality into Windows 8. We've really seen hide nor hair of that. No indication of massively increased performance in gaming at all. And more of a move towards the iOS store style of casual games, aiming for that market and accessibility via the tablet-style interface, and of course the inbuilt OS store, which is a little bit obnoxious to say the least. Why sell Halo 4 on PC when you can use it to sell consoles? I think it's rather possible to argue that the logic is not entirely there when you think about it for a second. Would PC gamers really flock to a console to play Halo 4? Possibly, maybe on the basis of the strength of the franchise, but I as a PC gamer personally do not want to play an FPS on console as a result of the interface issues that it suffers. Not to mention 30 FPS 720p is not really all that appealing to me. I think it's safe to say that Halo 4 would actually sell rather well on PC, honestly, and even if it did require Windows 8, I suppose that might be a way to push people into it, but it's understandable why they're gun-shy after the previous one. I don't really know. I think Microsoft is much, much more comfortable with people buying games on their consoles, and why? Well, they get a cut every time it happens. That doesn't happen on PC. Let's be honest, the piracy issues are certainly not as serious on console. I'm not denying it happens, but it doesn't happen anywhere near as much, and come on, they're also a company that gets their operating system pirated perhaps more than any other software in the world. It is not really all that surprising that they're not interested in putting their games on PC. What a shame. Michael Pachter seems to have an awful lot to say these days, and the Wedbush analyst has claimed that big IP blunders could equal horrible game sales for October. Now, as regards to what he's referring to, he's focusing on two particular titles: Medal of Honor Warfighter, which unfortunately received an average Metacritic score of 51, which would be the lowest score that EA has ever received for a major release since 2004's Catwoman, and the latest game in the 007 series, that being 007 Legends, which ended up faring even worse, that being, of course, Activision's property, and it got itself a woeful 45 Metacritic average review. In an absolutely stunning piece of analytical prose, Michael Pachter went on to claim that since the titles were poorly reviewed, they wouldn't probably sell all that well. Wow. God, I wish I could be paid $5 million a year just to talk about video games like that. That would be a wonderful thing indeed. I hope he doesn't get paid that much. That would be a little crazy. According to Gama Sutra, Warfighter's sales figures were fairly strong in the UK. It was actually the top-selling game 2 weeks ago, and 007 Legends was the 12th best-selling game there in its opening week, which was certainly not as strong. But Warfighter is clearly selling an awful lot of copies across the board, regardless of its poor reviews, and it really surprises me that analysts continue to hammer on the issue of poor Metacritic scores. Poor review scores mean poor sales, because they don't. And more to the point, good Metacritic scores do not mean good sales either. The fact of the matter is that this industry is very trend-based. Warfighter is going to get a lot of sales because it is part of the MMS genre, which is currently popular. At some point, it won't be anymore, but at the end of the day, games like Homefront sold a bunch of copies as well, and were also poorly reviewed across the board. It has nothing to do with it. Bad games still sell copies if marketed correctly, and of course if they happen to be part of a particular genre. In a final piece of absolutely stunning analytical skill, Pacto went on to claim that Dishonored and XCOM, while selling fairly well and being two solid releases, are not enough to match up against 2011's blockbusters Battlefield 3 and Arkham City. So, as we have just found out, an original stealth-based first-person shooter IP and a reboot of a classic turn-based strategy are probably not going to outsell big blockbuster MMS and a game with Batman in it. Wow. Truly, truly wow. I cannot imagine why people don't take this guy seriously. You know, I guess I'm part of the problem, because I'm reporting on what he's saying, and that actually gives him relevance. This guy is probably very good at his job when it comes to talking to investors, although, needless to say, he does tend to get things wrong from time to time. Quote, Borderlands is being sent out to die. Another quote, nothing is as powerful as one of the next-gen consoles. No PC can possibly stand up to that kind of firepower. Scott is the Admiral Akbar of the gaming industry. Whatever the case, this kind of advice is designed for investors that don't know what the hell they're talking about. As to why he keeps getting reported in the mainstream gaming press, I will never know. However, since he seems to be the centerpiece of so many relevant articles for whatever reason, I suppose I don't really have a choice but to report on what he's saying. I'm just hoping that they go to perhaps a slightly more insightful source in future when it comes to this kind of information. As to the crux of the article itself, it could of course be seen as unnecessary doomsaying, or it could be a sign of a global slowdown. I don't really think that's the case, and honestly I feel that sales in November are most likely going to completely trump this, especially with the release of a brand new hardware finally, which may very well reinvigorate the industry to some degree, and of course Black Ops 2 being a gigantic juggernaut of money, as well as the Skylanders franchise releasing about 5 million new titles. Yeah, I'm not really all that worried for the games industry at the moment when it comes to these particular IPs, and honestly, when it comes to Activision and EA, they could stand to take a few knocks here and there if they keep producing content that is not particularly good. Now, if you take our next story at face value, then you'll probably say, well, that backs up this entire argument about a global slowdown in the games industry. However, one needs to actually read the article. Shocking, I know. Patrick Redding, he happens to be the director of Splinter Cell Blacklist, and he claims that AAA titles are not the future. In fact, lowercase AAA game is actually where the industry should be heading. He was speaking at the Gamer Camp Festival in Toronto, and he basically said this. In fact, I can give you the quote right here. The market as a whole is undergoing a critical shift in priorities, a shift away from the absolute primacy of graphics and production values and content creation towards systematic depth. This trend is going to trigger a reality check from developers like me who work on established franchises with a large succession of sequels, and it's also going to be a call to arms for smaller games creators, including a number of people who are sitting in this room, I hope. So the idea really being that they're trying to move away, or at least that's his opinion, that the industry is trying to move away from the idea of the AAA, that being the capital AAA game. And honestly, I think we are getting to the point where these big production value-centric Hollywood spectaculars are becoming less and less viable. They're costing too much. They, quite frankly, are offering too little. And unless they happen to have a rather wonderful treadmill progression-based multiplayer mode, then they're not really selling all that well. They're certainly not giving great value to the consumer either. Redding suggests that a new class of game he calls lowercase AAA has key qualities such as the reliance on systematic design, open-ended games that allow for a range of possibilities and strategies instead of just one right approach. He also went on to say that the problem with this, aside from the obvious difficulty of making games that do that, is that the actual game creators need to give up authorial control. So what that means is the player should be able to tell their own story by exploring the game world and its mechanics. Interesting point, as far as I'm concerned, very much so, and of course he points to Minecraft as a great example of that, although I would not necessarily claim that Minecraft was a lowercase a game, more like, I don't know, a triple F when it comes to its production values. But honestly, production values aren't really all that important when it comes to video games. I'm more interested in the gameplay, I'm more interested in how intriguing the game happens to be. This isn't really a new thing. I don't think it's honestly a new trend. You can have a look at the games industry and say, oh well, we're only now just moving towards this land of milk and honey, where access to really interesting games that don't actually cost that much to make is happening. But no, it's been happening for years. It's been happening in the indie space, the freeware space, the Xbox Live Arcade, the Xbox Live Indie, PSN, and even the iOS Store. These are all sorts of venues where these kind of games have actually sold a great deal of copies, and needless to say, venues like Steam, GOG, and Gamersgate do allow for titles like this to become great successes. I think maybe we've reached a point where people are just looking for a new game experience, and game developers perhaps have succumbed to their own arrogance in believing that they, being the masters of their craft, are the guys that have to tell you the story and tell you which way to experience the game. This is not a book, this is not a movie, we are not talking about matters like cinematography, script writing really isn't all that relevant. What I'm more interested in seeing is a game that allows me a range of possibilities to express myself as a player. That is what games are all about. That is why games are truly great. And if I don't get those options, then I tend to find myself getting very, very bored very quickly. Not only that, but as I said before, production values have spiraled out of control to the point where I would absolutely love to see a bigger focus on $15 to $20 titles produced by smaller studios over a shorter period of time, based around certain concepts and mechanics. And we are getting a lot of games like that. I just need to see them go maybe just a little bit further. That's often expressed in such a way that the game ends up being a puzzle platformer based around a single gimmick or mechanic, and while that's kind of fun for a time, I want to see XCOM, I want to see Dishonored, I want to see Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines and Deus Ex. I want to see those kind of games. I want to see creative games, I want to see interesting concepts, and I want to see, more importantly, a game where the story is what I do, not what the protagonist does. And finally, an interview with CVG with Jean-Maxime Morris for the title Remember Me has revealed some interesting quotes. I'm not really sure, however, why they decided to go with the headline, "How stupid is this industry to only bet on stereotypes?" unquote. This was actually the end of this interview, which quite frankly had a lot of fairly interesting information about the forthcoming original IP Remember Me, whereby you play a character called Nillan, who is a professional memory hunter in a future setting, whereby she has to find out who imprisoned her and manipulated her memories by, of course, manipulating the memories of other people in order to restore her own. It's about 50% adventure, according to this article, and 50% third-person action. Now, the quote in question is kind of a curious one, because it seems like a really weird and out-of-place lashing out, really, at an industry which supposedly endorses a ton of stereotypes. It's a really odd one, because it seemed like a leading question from CVG. It started with, to play devil's advocate, why challenge gamers with a story that makes players ask questions? The biggest games in the world are just man with gun and a load of targets. Well, gee, I don't know, CVG. Maybe it's because you give games like Modern Warfare 3 a 9 out of 10, glowing praise and possibly a little bit of fellatio in the process. That might have something to do with it. Whatever the case, this does seem rather out of place indeed, and doesn't really raise any interesting points. The quote goes on to say, "Why not? Video games have become such a formatted medium, but it's the most powerful medium in the world, and it has the most potential in the future. Everything is formatted. We just wanted to do things differently. You said man with gun, but you forgot to say white man." The interview goes on to talk about the protagonist being of mixed race, female, her sexual orientation not being relevant, of course, leaps around, climbs, kicks guys' asses, remixes their memories, only kills a few people. Yeah, there's quite a few games that do this. Like, a female protagonist is not particularly interesting. An ultra-slim, ultra-acrobatic, oh look, she appears to be wearing a leather cat suit and doing backflips. Protagonist, that's not interesting either. That's not actually new at all. And I'll tell you this. I don't care about the orientation, the gender, or whatever when it comes to the character. Fine. You want to make it an attractive female? Okay. You want to make it a beefy male? Fine. What I care about is how interesting that character actually is, because if it happens to be a super attractive protagonist that is actually really dull and doesn't have any kind of character development whatsoever, then that sucks. But you can do that. It's easy. It doesn't really matter if the character is eye candy or not. And this whole idea that all games are ultra-violent these days, it's quite frankly nonsense. It simply is not the case at all. As I covered in a recent video, there are not actually all that many modern military shooters being released. There's only a few a year that go down this particular route of ultra-violence. You are seeing a lot more games where choice is actually presented. And this game looks fun, don't get me wrong, but it does seem very, very odd indeed to talk about video games as a formatted medium, and earlier on in the interview claimed that it is a story-driven linear experience and that's a conscious creative choice. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either it's a good thing that the medium is so formatted, or it's actually a problem. The whole interview doesn't really come off very well to me. You can read the whole thing, and you probably won't get a huge amount of information about Remember Me, even though it does seem interesting in certain respects. But that particular quote, it just comes off as pandering. It's like, hey, just look how edgy we are, look how innovative we are. It's like, no, I'm sorry. Lara Croft did this way before you did. I should also, of course, reference Konoko from Oni, and needless to say, Faith from Mirror's Edge. And interestingly enough, they were all in fairly similar universes, so I'm not sure that this game is as original when it comes to its subject matter and certainly its protagonist as the spokeswoman actually claims, but I'll keep an eye on it nonetheless. Alright folks, well the plan was to actually reduce the number of topics so that I got more chance to talk about them. Well, I did, and I massively overran, so there we go. You have reaped what you have sown. Regardless, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for watching Content Patch. I will be addressing viewer remarks shortly. I'll probably do it in tomorrow's episode. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.